I must point out that there are certainly troubling trends within the church today that relate to violations of the ninth commandment. Modernism, a major problem in the church since at least the early 20th century, has weakened moral teaching, leading to a relaxation of discipline and issues of chastity, purity, and marriage. For decades, the church consistently upheld its teaching on marriage, chastity, and purity. However, in recent years, there have been confusing signals and ambiguities that have led to violations of the ninth commandment. Pope Francis' apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, in 2016 suggested that divorced and remarried couples who are in adulterous unions could, in some cases, receive Holy Communion. This undermines Christ's teaching that whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, verse 18. The failure to clearly uphold the sanctity of marriage encourages moral laxity. Fiducia Supplicans, a declaration issued by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith in 2023, indicated that the Vatican now approves blessings for same-sex couples, despite Catholic teaching that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. From the Catechism, number 2357. This creates confusion about purity and chastity, blurring the lines between sin and virtue. Also, the sexual abuse crisis, which exploded into public view in the early 2000s, and again in 2018 with the McCarrick scandal, is a direct violation of the ninth commandment. Many clergy, instead of upholding purity, fell into grave sins of lust and preyed upon the innocent. Pope Francis refused to answer the accusations in the Vigano testimony, which alleged that he protected and promoted figures like McCarrick, despite knowing of his immoral behavior. In the past, the church promoted modest dress, purity, and chastity. But today in many parishes, there is little to no teaching on these issues. The acceptance of immodesty, even in church, and a lack of concern for purity in thought and deed weakens the spiritual life of Catholics. The Synod on Synodality has emphasized listening and inclusion at the expense of moral clarity. There are forces within the church pushing to change moral teachings on issues related to the ninth commandment, particularly regarding the acceptance of irregular unions, divorced and remarried cohabiting couples, greater acceptance of LGBTQ lifestyles, despite Catholic teaching on chastity. While the church cannot change divine law, the ambiguity and lack of strong leadership have led many to believe that impurity and lust are no longer serious sins. The church is in a time of crisis where confusion reigns, and many moral teachings are being undermined. But the truth does not change. The ninth commandment is still in effect, and the faithful must resist the modernist errors that downplay purity, chastity, and the sanctity of marriage. Many today engage in emotional infidelity where deep, intimate connections are formed outside marriage, often through texting and social media or workplace relationships. Even if there is no physical act, it still violates the spirit of the ninth commandment by stirring desires that should belong only within marriage. Third, this plays out in attacks on the sanctity of marriage. The world increasingly downplays the importance of fidelity, treating marriage as disposable. Movies and books often glorify affairs, making them seem exciting rather than sinful. Cohabitation and casual relationships are treated as normal, while lifelong sacramental marriage is considered outdated. The ninth commandment is a call to interior purity. Christ said, "Whoever looks at a woman to lust after has already committed adultery with her in his heart." From Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. The ninth commandment calls for purity of heart, not just avoiding sinful acts, but training our desires toward holiness. This means guarding our eyes and thoughts by limiting harmful media and avoiding temptation, strengthening marriages by prioritizing communication and praying together, fostering true love by seeing others as persons and not objects of desire. In a world that normalizes lust, keeping the ninth commandment is countercultural, but it leads to true love, respect, and peace in our hearts, marriages, and society. Let us look at the story of David and Bathsheba in the second book of Samuel, chapters 11 and 12. King David, who had been a righteous and God-fearing ruler, stayed home in Jerusalem while his army was at war. One evening, he walked on the roof of his palace and saw a beautiful woman bathing. This woman was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's loyal soldiers. Instead of turning away and guarding his heart, David allowed his desire to grow. He inquired about her, sent for her, and committed adultery with her. Later, Bathsheba sent word to David that she was pregnant. This put David in a difficult situation because Uriah, her husband, had been away fighting battle, and people would realize the child was not his. To hide what he had done, David devised a plan. He summoned Uriah home from battle, hoping he would sleep with his wife and think the child was his. But Uriah, being a faithful soldier, refused to go home while his fellow soldiers were still at war. When this plan failed, David took an even darker step. He ordered Uriah to be sent to the front lines of battle and abandoned there to be killed. After Uriah had died, David married Bathsheba, thinking he had covered up his sin. The prophet Nathan confronted David with a parable. There were two men in one city, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had many sheep, but the poor man had only one little lamb that he loved dearly. One day the rich man took the poor man's lamb and killed it to feed a guest. David, angered by this injustice, declared, "That man deserves to die." Nathan replied, "You are the man." He revealed that David had stolen another man's wife and committed murder to cover it up. Because of his sin, Nathan told David that the sword would never depart from his house, meaning his family would suffer conflict, and that the child conceived in sin would die as a consequence of David's actions. Realizing the gravity of his sin, David repented sincerely. He wrote Psalm 51, a prayer of deep sorrow and a plea for God's mercy. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy great mercy, and according to the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my iniquity." Psalm 51, verse 1. Although God forgave David, he still suffered the consequences of his sin. His family experienced turmoil, and his later years were filled with sorrow. David's lustful gaze led him down a path of adultery, deceit, and murder. This illustrates the truth of Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. Whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. David's initial sin of coveting his neighbor's wife led him to commit adultery, deception, and even murder to cover it up. David tried to hide his sin, but nothing is hidden from God. David was forgiven, but he still faced earthly suffering because of his actions.